target these young men? What can I offer them if they take away this program? And he said, son, you're already giving them the most important thing that you can give them. You're telling them that you believe in them. And you're having an honest conversation with them. And I realized that this is one of the reasons that we've, I think, gotten where we are, is we've stopped having these honest conversations. At the end of this meeting, Father Boyle said to me, he started asking me about gangs in Philly, and I said, we really don't have gangs in the way that I knew gangs growing up in California. Father Boyle's in Los Angeles, and I had grown up in Sacramento. And he said, you're from Sacramento, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm from this community called Natomas. Natomas is the real homogenized name that we call the Mexican neighborhood that I grew up in. And I figured, well, this old white priest is not going to know the neighborhood I grew up in called Garden, this gang-infested neighborhood I come from. And he said, oh, okay. He said, I used to work in Sacramento. I said, really? He said, yeah, I used to be a priest at Jesuit high school. I said, orale, vato. I said, I'm from Gardenland, fool. And then he looked at me strangely, like maybe some of you are, and said, he looked at me as if I might be Latino, and I had to explain, no, I just played one on TV. But that I grew up in I was the biracial kid of a alcoholic lesbian mother raised in a Mexican neighborhood, so I understand a little bit about struggle, and that's kind of why I think I identify with the kids that are brought to me. And he looked at me as if to say, orale. I explained to him that one of the reasons that I'm here now is because of the love and the kindness shown to me by two folks, Jess and Dee Fernandez. They were a couple that had grown up in Gardenland. And Gardenland is a little neighborhood in Sacramento that was, it was where Mexican families had come when they moved north so that they can create a strong community. And for generations, these folks worked at Blue Diamond, the almond factory, and they worked for the railroads. They worked as seasonal workers, and this is where Dee and Jess came from. They were childhood sweethearts. They would fall in love, they would get married, and then they would eventually move on to the street that my family would move on to. And they would raise their children, and their sons would become my best friends. And they became a surrogate family to me. And I would crash on their couch when I was a teenager. My mom had some problems, and Jess recognized that I was showing the telltale signs of a kid who was suffering from neglect. And so his home became my home. And we would fellowship in the front yard. I and his sons and other neighborhood men would gather around, and we'd sit and hold these honest dialogues about what it meant to be men. At least, I don't think I knew that at the time, but I discovered it later, that this is what was being imparted to me. And I just want to ask, can we go to my presentation real quick? Thanks. And I eventually started crashing on his couch, and one morning after I awakened from having slept on Fernandez's couch, Jess said to me, look, son, I never mind you staying here, but I have to say that if you're going to eat here like one of my sons, and if you're going to sleep here like one of my sons, I'm going to ask you to work here like one of my sons. And maybe for one of the first times I was being held accountable in my life. And that summer, as other kids slept in during the summer, I got up every morning at 5 o'clock, and with Jess and his sons, we got on Jess's roach coach. He just had this dream that he could retire from his hard work at the state. He would drive this truck that is so common in Philadelphia. You see them, near the temple, you see them at Penn. But in California, you really only saw them at construction sites. And we'd get on, and we'd every morning get on that truck and go to the warehouse to stock up this truck. And I would carefully write down everything Jess said. If it was 20 bags of Doritos, I'd write it down. I made sure it wasn't 21 because I wanted to be correct. I wanted to be precise. I didn't want to let Jess down because Jess had expectations for me. Maybe for one of the first times somebody had expectations for me. And maybe I shouldn't say that because the truth is, after my father died when I was 9, there were a lot of expectations for me, but they were pretty low. But Jess actually expected something from me, so I didn't want to let him down. And the other reason I didn't want to let Jess down was because Jess was the only man since my father had died to call me son. And that meant everything to a little kid in a growing up in a neighborhood where he felt so isolated to feel part of something bigger than himself. So I again, work diligently to make this man proud. And sometimes it's not all the big things that a person can give you, particularly a man to a young man. Sometimes it's the little things that matter the most. I remember being about 14 and Jess taught me how to tie a tie. Now, I don't know how many of you remember who taught you how to tie a tie, but I imagine every time you're dragged to a wedding, you think about that person, right? My mom certainly didn't know how to tie a tie, and Jess sat there and carefully went over it over and over and over again. Eventually, I learned to tie this tie, and Jess explained, I'm sorry I can't show you something more sophisticated, but this is a square knot. It's the only knot I know, but it's gotten me by this far. So that was my introduction to ties, and now every day when I go to Temple University Hospital, I get up in the morning, I think about Jess as I begin the process of tying that tie, and my ties have become a little more sophisticated. I now typically rock a half Windsor, no longer limited to a half knot or a knot. But I think about Jess every day that I go to work as the trauma outreach coordinator there. My job can be boiled down to a couple basic ideas. One, I attempt to reduce the number of young men who will be brought to us as the victims of gunshot injury. Each year, Temple University sees 500 gunshot patients, and half of them are aged 25 and younger. So we know who's increasingly the victim of gunshot injury. So what I'll do is I bring young men into the hospital who've been charged with crimes, who are deemed most likely to kill or be killed, and I walk them through the life and death experiences of a young man, 16, who was murdered in Philadelphia a few years ago and treated at our hospital. And I walk them moment by moment through the last periods and last minutes of his life. And that's one group. And then the other group of the young men, as I explained, that I work with this project called Pierce, and what we do is we try to take kids once they've been shot, once they're laying in bed and that light has gone off for them, because nothing serves as a wake-up call to young men like having hot lead race through you. And in those moments, the light goes on, and it's a teachable moment. And so I try to capture these dudes in the teachable moment to begin the process of doing something you think has probably come pretty easy, and that is to basically convince them that they want to live. It's a little more difficult than you might think. I remember one day going into the room of the Spanish kid, and he was laying there, and this was the third time he had been shot in the last 4 years, and he was 20. And I walked into his room, having known his chart pretty well, and I kneeled down beside his bed, and I put my chin on his rail, and I said, look, dog, if you're trying to kill yourself, you're going to have to get enemies who are better shots. And then he looked at me, and he began to weep, and he said, sir, it's not that I want to die, I just don't know how to live. And that's what a lot of these young dudes are feeling. There's a sense of hopelessness that is so pervasive in these neighborhoods. These kids have been enlisted into the unholiest of wars. They have no idea who they're fighting or what they're fighting for, but they are armed by the time they're old enough to shave, and they will either be killed or kill somebody over the smallest thing. This has incredible implications for a city that is trying to reclaim itself in real tough economic times. There's new data out that just came out yesterday, in fact, talking about where we rank. I was actually surprised now. Philadelphia, as a city, is now down to being only the 15th deadliest city. We should clap for that. Now here's my caveat. I think we still are the deadliest large city. You know, they have cities up there, little towns in Tennessee that have probably 100 people living in it. You lose 2 people to homicide, they become the deadliest large city in America, or the deadliest city in America. But you can see from this that we experience 5 times the rate of homicides compared to the rest of the United States. Compared to the US average, we have 5 times the number of homicides per 100,000 people. And if you look at a map of Philadelphia from back in 2006, you can see why we have become such a deadly city, a city that's known as Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, right? In 2006, people spent a lot of time talking about the violence in Philadelphia. That's when we had the most homicides on record of any years in the previous 10 years. But I always try to point out to folks when I'm talking about violence in Philadelphia that you cannot just look at the homicides because that doesn't paint an accurate portrait. The fact of the matter is we save 80% of gunshot patients that come through our hospital, 80%. 4 out of 5 times we're going to save that young person's life, or at least return them a pulse and a blood pressure and give them their breathing back. We never really return them the life that they had. So in order to get 406 homicides, you have to ask yourself how many people were shot in that year. Well, to get 406 homicides, we had to have 2,004 people shot. You can see where Temple is, where that T is, and you understand that it's easy to understand why we're one of the deadliest large cities in the country and why our hospital leads the state for the number of gunshots treated.